So there should be some things that you all should know about me beyond what was said. I grew up in the hood in Miami, in a poor neighborhood. I came from a community in which drug use was prevalent. I kept a gun in my car. I engaged in petty crime. I used and sold drugs. But as has been said, I stand before you today also, emphasis on also, a professor at Columbia University who studies drug addiction. And I know what some of you all are wondering, especially the ones who haven't Googled me yet. How in the world did you get from there to here? Fortunately, there were a few key decisions in my life that changed my course. After high school, I joined the Air Force, and joining the Air Force started me on the path of higher education. And I ultimately earned a PhD in neuroscience. You see, I studied neuroscience specifically so I could solve the drug addiction problem. See, I fully believe that the crime and poverty in my community was a direct result of crack cocaine. And so I reasoned that if I could solve or cure drug addiction, I could fix crime and poverty in my community. So I was told, and I fully believed, that drugs like crack cocaine were so addictive that the user only needed one hit to become addicted. So in 1986, when Congress passed laws punishing crack cocaine trafficking violations 100 times more harshly than those for powder cocaine, I thought that was quite appropriate. I mean, after all, 16 of the Congressional Black Caucus members voted for this legislation. I thought it sent the clear message to crack users and dealers in places like my old community that we wouldn't tolerate them destroying the neighborhood or the community. But I was unprepared for what I would learn as I went about making my contribution to the study of the neurobiology of drug addiction. And ultimately, this new information that I learned changed how I viewed the role of drugs in the whole poverty crime cycle. I first began questioning my thinking when I discovered that drugs like crack cocaine were not as addictive as we had been told. There is no drug in which the user uses one time and becomes addicted. In fact, 80 to 90% of the people who use illegal drugs are not addicts. They don't have a drug problem. I think I need to say that again. 80 to 90% of the people who use illegal drugs don't have a drug problem. Most are responsible members of our society. They are employed. They pay their taxes. They take care of their families. And in some cases, they even become president of the United States. All three of these men reported illegal drug use when they were younger. Now, the point here, my point is not to besmirch or tarnish the reputation of these men. They all serve their country. My point is this: their drug use did not result in an inevitable downward spiral leading to debauchery and addiction. And the experience of these men is the rule, not the exception. The overwhelming majority of drug users don't have a drug problem. Now, the notion or the idea or the basis for this one hit and you're hooked idea comes from experiments conducted in the 1960s and 1970s. Laboratory animals were given unlimited access to drugs like cocaine and methamphetamine will repeatedly self-administer or repeatedly press a lever to receive intravenous injections of these drugs until it kills them. These early experiments provided evidence for the drug-seeking until death notion. But that's not the whole story. In the cages in these experiments that I'm explaining or describing contain nothing else but a lever leading to intravenous drug injections. The most interesting part of the story for me, however, is what happened when the animals were presented with an alternative as well as the drug lever. The alternative being something like a sexually receptive mate or a sweet treat. When given an option, animals do not self-administer drugs until death. In fact, the animals will often take the non-drug alternative over the drug. We followed up these experiments in my laboratory using human research participants. We recruited crack cocaine addicts from New York City. By the way, my use of the term addict conforms to the DSM definition of substance use disorder. And equally important, we met all human subjects and regulatory requirements before initiating these experiments. So we brought the cocaine users into the lab. We gave them a choice between $5 and a hit of cocaine, crack cocaine, worth more than $5. We repeated this with each person many times over several days. What we found was that the crack cocaine users chose to take drug on about half of the occasions and money on the other half of the occasions. Even a nominal amount of money was enough to deter crack cocaine addicts from taking drug on at least half of the occasions. Not exactly the insane anything for a hit behavior that I was taught that crack cocaine users would display. We next recruited methamphetamine addicts and repeated that same experiment. Just like the crack cocaine users, the methamphetamine users chose to take methamphetamine on about half of the occasions and money on the other half of the occasions. We next raised the cash reward to $20. And when $20 was the alternative, the methamphetamine users almost never took the drug. They predominantly took the money. Just like the laboratory animals, when presented with an attractive alternative, even people diagnosed with drug addiction do not choose to take the drug. Stated another way, attractive alternatives dramatically decrease drug use. These were definitely not the results that I was expecting when I set out to solve the drug addiction problem. So, since my time in the hood, I had always viewed the plight of my family and community through the lens of those bad drugs. I even perpetuated the narrative that drugs were the problem. So you can imagine my shock and confusion as I started to uncover evidence that crime and poverty were mostly independent of drug use. I mean, crime was in poor communities long before crack cocaine ever hit the streets. And annual FBI statistics clearly show that the overwhelming majority of prisoners were not addicted or intoxicated during the time of their crime. And as I think back over my family situation growing up. We certainly were poor well before drugs ever entered the picture. And I certainly engaged in petty crime. But it had nothing to do with drug addiction. It was about money and status. In other words, if you take drugs out of the equation, poverty and crime still exists. It's not drug addiction causing people to commit crime. It's other factors. So, to make matters worse, drug laws are not uniformly enforced across all segments of our society. And this perpetuates the cycle of poverty and crime. The popular notion is that poor black people use crack cocaine, while wealthier white people tend to use powder cocaine. And in 1988, Congress extended the crack cocaine law such that we now punished possessions of crack cocaine 100 times more harshly than those for powder cocaine. Scientifically, it makes no sense. Crack and powder cocaine are the same drug. They both have pharmacological, predictable effects. As the dose of either are increased, so too are the effects on blood pressure, heart rate, euphoria, addictive potential, you name it. It's true that smoking crack cocaine produces a more intense effect than swallowing or snorting powder cocaine. But that increased intensity is due to route of administration, not the drug itself. Because injecting powder cocaine dissolved in water produces the identical intense effects as smoking crack cocaine. And those same laws require that anyone caught with even small amounts of crack cocaine were required to serve a minimum of 5 years in prison. But that's not even the real injustice. Here's the real injustice. The real injustice is this. More than 80% of the people convicted under these laws were black, despite the fact that most users of all forms of cocaine are white. This selective targeting and racial discrimination has contributed to the horrifying statistic that 1 in 3 black males can expect to spend time in prison. I'm a father of 3 black sons. One has spent time in jail because of drug laws. The same number, by contrast, for white boys is about 1 in 20. So the question becomes, what do we do about this shameful situation? We can do at least 3 things that would have an immediate positive impact. First, my research shows that attractive alternatives can decrease drug use because meaningful employment is one of the most important attractive alternative reinforcers. Providing viable economic opportunities will go a long way in decreasing drug abuse. Second, I believe we should decriminalize all drugs. Decriminalization would be like treating drugs like a traffic violation. Someone might be required to pay a fine if they're caught with possessing illegal drugs, but they will not be subjected to criminal prosecution. When you consider this fact, each year we arrest 1.5 million people in this country for drug law violations, and 80% of those folks are for simple drug possession. Decriminalization of possession would have a huge impact. Countries such as Portugal and the Czech Republic have already decriminalized drugs. Their drug-using rates and overdose rates are lower than ours in the United States and are equal to or lower than their European neighbors. But under decriminalization, significant portions of their society are not stigmatized, marginalized, and unfairly incarcerated. If our goal in the United States is to have a legal system that treats everyone fairly, one that's just, then we must change the way we criminalize and selectively enforce drug laws. Third, I believe science should be driving our drug policy and drug education, even if it makes you and me uncomfortable. The first step is to be honest about drug use. If we're honest, we can decrease the number of people who die from drugs dramatically. Here's just one example about being honest. 75% of the people who die from a heroin-related overdose death do so because they combine heroin with another sedative, like alcohol or benzodiazepine. The public health education message is simple. Rather than vilifying heroin, the message should be, if you're going to use heroin, don't combine it with another sedative. People will always use drugs. They always have used drugs. We must learn to live with this fact. We already take this approach with other potentially dangerous activities, such as sex, alcohol, even driving. I've come a long way since the mean streets of Miami, and even a longer way since the starry-eyed young man who wanted to eradicate drugs as the best way to deal with the drug problem. Today, I no longer want to eradicate or eliminate drugs from our society. It would be naive to think so. Don't get me wrong, I still want to help people who have a drug problem. But equally important, I want to help keep safe recreational users who don't have a problem, because they make up the vast majority of drug users. What I now know is that the drugs themselves are not the problem. The real problems are poverty, unemployment, selective drug law enforcement, ignorance, and the dismissal of science surrounding these drugs. As a scientist, I'm doing my best to lessen the ignorance by disseminating the science. I hope you will take some of the information that I have shared with you today to help join me in my efforts. Thank you.